If you're looking for a free course in Italian wine, you've come to the right place. Tony Margiotta here. This is part 4 of a multi-series of Italian wine videos, all covering a different topic so you can master Italian wine in small, easy chunks. So far in this course, you've learned about how Italy's geography and climate make it the most abundant wine-producing country in the world. You learned about Italy's 20 wine-producing regions and how each one produces its own unique wines. But before we get into the sub-regions, I want to cover a pretty easy topic, but super important in understanding Italian wine, and that's classifications. Make sure you hit the subscribe button and the bell button below so you don't miss out on the next videos of this Italian course and much, much more. Whether your goal is a wine certification or you just want to enrich yourself with some Italian wine knowledge, you've come to the right place. So if you've seen my previous videos, you'd know that the pentagon of wine is your way of organizing massive amounts of information about Italian wine into 5 easy buckets. As you can see, classifications have their own corner on the pentagon because they're super important, but also super easy to understand. Let's look at this classification pyramid. What are the classifications exactly? Well, the Italians came up with this system of classifications in order to produce quality wines consistently and to standardize certain vineyard and winemaking practices. Without these classifications, Italian producers could put whatever they want on the wine labels without any punishment if they've committed fraud, for example. These classifications are enforced by the Italian government. There are 4 main types of Italian wine classifications. Most people will tell you that this pyramid illustrates levels of quality, with vino da tavola, or table wine, being the lowest quality, and DOCG being the highest at the top of the pyramid. But that would be an oversimplification. If you've seen my video on the top 10 rules of Italian wine, you'd know that there's always an exception to the rule in Italy. Each level of the pyramid has actually a unique set of regulations that wineries must adhere to if they want their wines classified a certain way. So what we're going to do here is we've got the vino da tavola, we have the IGT, the DOC, and the DOCG. Let's translate those for a second to get a little bit more clarification. On the lowest part of the pyramid, we have the VDT, or vino da tavola, which literally means table wine. Then you have IGT, which in Italy they call indicazione geografica tipica, which means typical geographic indication. Then you have the DOC, which is in Italy denominazione d'origine controllata, which means controlled denomination of origin. And then you have DOCG, which is denominazione d'origine controllata e garantita, controlled denomination of origin and guaranteed. So if you were to look at these classifications and think that DOCG is the only one that produces the highest quality wines, then you'd naturally only want to buy wines with the DOCG classification on the label, right? But if you did that, you'd be missing out on some of the most fantastic wines ever. As you go from the bottom to the top of this pyramid, what's really happening are 2 things. The regulations become more severe as to how the wine's made and the area where the vineyards can be located. As it goes up to the DOCG, the area where the vineyards are located gets smaller and smaller, and the regulations get more and more severe. So in the next couple of slides, we'll cover these 2 things so you have a deeper understanding of the classifications. From a buying standpoint, like if I go shopping for Italian wine, I personally purchase wines from IGT, DOC, and DOCG. It sort of doesn't matter to me so much per se. It's really the vino da tavola classification that I don't really bother with, because you're not really going to save any money for the quality that you get with the vino da tavola. Now, on the other hand, if I was in Italy and I was at a restaurant and they were serving me vino da tavola, or if I was in my father's village in Italy and they were serving me vino da tavola, of course I would not refuse it, okay? But it's very, very inexpensive in Italy, and so after you export it, the vino da tavola really is not of value anymore. The IGT, on the other hand, actually didn't exist until the 1970s. Back in the 1970s, it was really only DOCG, DOC, and Vino da Tavola. The IGT came about when some Tuscan producers were planting Cabernet Sauvignon and Merlot in their vineyards, which are not Italian grapes. So they were not allowed to obtain a DOC for their quality wines because of that. So what they did was they lobbied to create a brand new classification that would allow French grape varietals in their wines. That's how the famous Super Tuscan wines came into being. Now today in Italy, there are countless IGT wines that are using 100% native Italian varietals as well as French varietals. So let me explain why that is in the next couple of slides. So, what exactly do these classifications do? Each classification has its own sets of rules and regulations. By law, the location has to be within certain borderlines in order for it to qualify for a certain qualification. That's because of the soil, the geographic location, and the climate all change from one area to the next. The farming practices are also specified in terms of how many plants per hectare can be planted, what the yield limits are. The yield limits are the amount of weight of grapes per hectare that can be produced, and that's usually measured in quintals per hectare. That's also controlled. For winemaking techniques, they stipulate the percentage of each grape varietal allowed in that specific classification of wine. It also stipulates how long a wine should be aged in barrel, how long it should lay in the bottle before it's released to the public, and what else? Wine characteristics. The characteristics are listed as well in these regulations as to what the color of the wine should look like, the range of alcohol that's permitted in the wine, like 12 to 14%, for example. That's actually written into the regulations of many, many Italian wines, as well as the amount of residual sugar that's allowed in certain types of wines. All of these regulations are put in place to produce consistent quality every year. Without these measures in place, a specific wine type wouldn't taste anything like the other from one producer to the next. This ensures customers that buy that certain type of wine, it gives them assurance as to what to expect. So, for example, if they buy a Montepulciano d'Abruzzo, there's some expectation as to what it will taste like generally. Most varietal wines, like, for example, Primitivo or Nero d'Avola or Sangiovese, when they write the name of that varietal on the front label, the wine typically requires 85 to 90% minimum of that varietal to be present in the bottle by Italian law. Imagine putting Cabernet Sauvignon on the front label and there's only 50% of Cabernet grapes in that wine, and the other 50% are made up of like 3 or 4 different grape varietals, making up the rest. So if you buy a cab expecting a cab and it doesn't taste like a cab, that's a problem. That's where these classifications come into play. You'd think all these rules would homogenize the wine types and there'd be little difference in taste from one producer to the next. But the beauty is that even with these measures in place, the art of winemaking allows individual expression and stylistic differences, even when all the regulations are followed, which is great. Earlier, I was talking about how some wineries produce wines with 100% native Italian grapes, and they still don't have the DOC status because they don't agree with some of the regulations, like farming practices and winemaking techniques, for example. I know of a small village in Sardinia that makes a very characteristic IGT wine that would change dramatically if they adhered to one of the nearby DOC classifications. The reason was not the grape varietal, but instead the winemaking and vineyard practices. The only way around this is for that village to lobby and obtain its own DOC, and it's not an easy process. So some wine producing areas just stick with the IGT for certain types of wines, and that's perfectly fine. Today, there are wines that contain international grapes that also have the DOC status, so a lot has changed since the days of the 1970s with the Tuscan producers. the classifications are sort of always changing for the most part. And to complicate matters a little further, the European Union got involved in wine regulations and came up with their own classifications. But it's actually not that big of a deal. Take a look at this graph. Luckily, they only added 2 more classifications, which you will see from time to time, which is the DOP and the IGP. Take a look at the IGP for a second. That's exactly the same thing as the IGT. So it's sort of a freebie in terms of memorizing info. The IGT and the IGP are interchangeable, whether it's EU or Italian. It doesn't change the regulations as far as I understand it. The DOP is a little tricky though. See how the DOP is attached to both the Italian DOC and the Italian DOCG? According to the EU standards, the DOC and DOCG are practically the same thing as the DOP. Some producers have adopted the DOP, but many haven't. I see more of an adoption of the IGP, which makes 0 difference, whereas putting a DOP on the label instead of a DOCG sort of downplays the strict regulations of the DOCG and equates it with a DOC, which just doesn't seem quite fair. And just know that you will see these from time to time. In terms of understanding Italian classifications, I would just spend more time focusing on the original Italian pyramid and just know that the DOP or IGP show up from time to time. What do they mean? The IGP is very similar to the IGT. So instead of indicazione geografica tipica, this time it's with the EU, it's indicazione geografica protetta, which just means protected geographic indication. Then the DOP is denominazione d'origine protetta, which simply means protected denomination of origin. And that's it for Italian wine classifications. So in the next video, we're going to cover Italy's subregions and tie in the classifications because they really do sort of work together. So until next time, make sure you hit the subscribe button so you don't miss out on the next videos about Italian wine and much, much more. Look out for part 5 of this Italian wine course, and I'll see you in the next video.